Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Hope y'all are doing well. Today we're going to build a digital library using Python and React. This is how the finished app is going to look like. We're going to have two tabs, a Discover tab and a Library tab. Looking at the Library tab, we're going to have three sections. One is completed and then unfinished. So these are the books that you have but you haven't finished yet. And then you have a wish list. These are the books that you want to buy. You can move the books between the sections. So let's go ahead and show you how it works. So if you go to the Discover tab, let's say there's a new book that you're interested in and we're going to search for it, right? So let's say it's going to be a book related to like pandemic. So you're going to search it and then you get a bunch of search results here. You get up to 40. Each of them will have the cover of the book, category, Google rating, the author, and then like a small brief description of the book. So let's go ahead and pick a book. So let's say we're gonna add this one, How to Prevent the Next Pandemic. So you click the button over here called Add Book. Then you get a pop-up that says that book added to wish list. Now if you go to Library over here, you scroll all the way down. You can see that in the wish list, you have your new book called How to Prevent the Next Pandemic. So now let's say that you have went ahead and purchased the book. In this case, you can click the purchased book button over here. If you click it, it moves to the unfinished section and you get a pop-up telling you that the book has been moved to a different section. So now let's say that you went through the whole book and then finished it. So you want to move it to the completed section. So you go ahead and hit the button called Completed Book. And now the book moves all the way up to the top in the completed section. Now once it's in the completed section, you can go ahead and rate the book. You can see there are books that I already rated. So the Bitcoin Standard got 4-star, Lifespan has 3-starred. You can go ahead and change them dynamically and the data is also going to be retained. The ones that are not rated yet are the ones over here. You can see I have a text that says rate book and then you have the stars over here. So let's go ahead and rate the book. Let's say we want to rate How to Prevent the Next Pandemic and I'm going to give it a 4-star, right? So let's go ahead and hit it. It says book rated successfully. Now if I refresh, it should retain the rating. So let's go ahead and refresh. Go to Library. And now you see this already has a star. We're gonna do the same for the Outwitting the Devil book. So let's give it like a 5-star. And it says successfully. Now if you refresh, it's retained. You can go ahead and change it if you want. Let's now, make it a 2-star. So I'm gonna go ahead and do it a 2-star and then do a refresh. The 2-star has been retained. So that's what we're gonna be building. I am gonna break this build into 3 parts. In the first part, which is this part, we're gonna go ahead and code the backend from scratch. In the second part, I'm gonna go ahead and show you how you can build the front end. And in the third part, we're gonna pretty much take a zoomed out look at the whole application, review the code, and talk about how the whole thing works. So the third one is gonna be a smaller one. So if you don't wanna see the whole build, both in terms of part 1 and 2, I would just encourage waiting for part 3 and then watching that from start to finish. All right, so that's what we're going to be building. So now let's start to actually build the backend. So I'm going to zoom in. This is going to be our backend code pretty much. I'm going to go ahead and delete everything so that we can create everything from scratch. All right. I do have a Postgres instance running locally. So if I go over here, you can see that I have a Postgres table called book. It has a few columns. So you have ID, which is an auto incrementing ID, volume ID. This is the book ID that we're getting from the Google Books API. Google Books identifies a unique book by something called a volume ID. So we're storing that in our backend so that we don't have to call the Google API every single time. Then you have the title of the book. We have a string that's going to be a concatenation of all the authors. And then you have a thumbnail and then the state. This is the state the book is in. That means whether it's in completed, to be completed or a wish list, right? So remember you had the 3 sections over here: completed, unfinished, and wish list. So those are going to be the 3 different states. And then rating is what the book has as the rating. If I do a select data, you can see these are the mock data that I have that you're seeing over here. And for, let's say, the book we just rated, Outwitting the Devil, you can see it has a rating of 2. And over here you see a 2-star, right? So you can have up to 5. All right, so we are gonna go ahead and keep the data we have here so that we can actually test our backend properly with some data that's already there, okay? All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and delete everything so that we can start from scratch. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close the server. And you're gonna see that if I do a refresh, you don't see anything anymore because the backend is not working at all, okay? We are gonna use Insomnia. This is the tool we're gonna use to test our endpoints. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a new request. And actually, let me create the new request later on. Okay, so this is the tool we're gonna be using to test our endpoints. All right, so now that you saw the Postgres database is running, let's actually start writing the code, okay? So our backend is gonna be in Python FastAPI. I have a few other videos on how FastAPI works and how it's a very cool backend framework that you can use to build APIs very, very quickly. The APIs are also very well documented, as you'll see in the video, so I would highly recommend giving FastAPI a try if you're coming from like a Flask or Django. All right, so the first thing is going to be the import statements that we need. So we're going to go ahead and import our Postgres package. And then we need the list type from typing import list. And then we need another thing called base model from Pydantic. You're going to see how all these tie together. We need UVcorn to run our backend FastAPI. And then from FastAPI, we need the actual FastAPI class and then status. And then one more we need is something called cores. This is going to let us make cross-origin request from the React app to the backend without running into any issues. Okay, so that's all the imports that we need. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and create a mock status endpoint. So very straightforward to create endpoints in FastAPI. So the first thing you need is to just instantiate the app, which is going to be just a first API. Yes. And then we can go ahead and add some middleware. This is going to make sure our cores issue works. So we're going to give it the cores middleware. We're going to allow all origins. There you go. And then we're gonna allow credentials. So these are just boilerplate. You don't really need to know how it works. It just works when it comes to cores issues. So we're gonna allow all the methods to be allowed in the HTTP request coming from the front end. And then we're gonna allow all headers too. Okay. All right, so now into the bit that actually matters. Let's go ahead and create our first endpoint. It's gonna be called a status endpoint. And then we're gonna do a async def called check status. And then we're just gonna return hello world. This is just to see that everything's working correctly or not. All right, and I'm gonna go ahead and start it. That did not start because we are not running the app. So let's go ahead and run the app first. So we're gonna do, there you go. And then we're gonna actually do the UVcorn run. There you go. So we're gonna do a UVcorn.run, pass in the app, give it a host, which is gonna be 0.0.0. We're gonna give it a port of 8000. And that's all we need. All right, so now let's run it. There you go, it's running. Now the cool thing is, if you go to localhost 8000 and then docs, you can see there's very cool documentation that FastAPI generates for you automatically. So you can see we have our check status endpoint. If you want, you can literally call it from here. We try it out and then execute. You can see we're getting a response of hello world. Okay. If you change it, let's say we're going to call it hello world 222. And now let's reload, refresh, and then try it out again. Now you see you're getting hello world 222. So this is a very cool way to test out your application. You can also use tools like Postman or Insomnia, but we're going to use a bit of both. We're also going to use Insomnia, but this is also handy, so we can just use this one too. All right, so now you know how to create a very basic version of the status endpoint. Now let's go ahead and actually create endpoints that are going to return the data that is there in our Postgres tables. All right, so the first thing we need is to create a model. So we're going to create a class called book that inherits from base model. This is coming from Pydantic. And then the ID is going to be an int, which is none. So we're also going to take in none. Volume ID is going to be a string. Title is going to be a string too. Authors, in our case, we're just going to do a concatenation of all the authors. And Google API does not have authors for some of the books, so we are going to make it nullable. Then we're going to have thumbnail. This is going to be the thumbnail of the book. State is an int. This is the state from completed, wishlist, or unfinished. We're going to represent it as an int just to make things clean. But let's say int of 0 is going to be completed, 1 is going to be unfinished, 2 is going to be wishlist. And then we have the rating, which is also going to be nullable. The only two things that are not nullable is the title and the state. You can see that the ID is nullable, even though in our database you don't expect ID to be nullable because it's the auto incrementing ID. But the reason I have it set to nullable here is sometimes we would want the front end to pass a book object to the backend without an ID, because the ID can be generated when writing the data into the database. There is a better way to do it, but for now we're just gonna use this one book class for both writing to the database and also accepting a request coming from the front end. All right, so that's our book model. And now let's go ahead and create our first legit endpoint, which is gonna be to get all the books. That's gonna be a get endpoint that's gonna give us all the books. The response model, this is gonna be the type of the response you're gonna get, which is gonna be a list, and it's gonna be a list of book. And the status code on a successful request is gonna be status.http 200, okay. And then once again async, we're gonna call it get books. And now to get the books, of course, you need to connect to the database at first. Okay, how do you do that? It's very simple. All you do is call the connect function and then pass it a database. The name of our database is example.db. You give it a user, in our case it's called Docker. You give it a password, in our case it's called Docker again. And then you give it a host, in our case it's 0.0.0. All right, so that should let you instantiate the connection. Now that you have the connection, you want a cursor. I do have a few other videos about how you can use Postgres with Python. So if you're confused at this point, I would recommend checking that one out too. So now that we have a cursor, I am gonna go ahead and execute our query, which is gonna be a very straightforward query. That's gonna be a select star from book, and then we're gonna order by ID descending. This is gonna make sure that the highest IDs are at the top of our list. That means the most recently created book is gonna be at the top. All right, and now that we executed the query, we're gonna get all our rows from the cursor. And now we're gonna call it formatted books, which is gonna be an empty list. We're gonna iterate through all our rows, and then for each rows, we are gonna append into our list a book object. Because remember, the response model is a list of book objects. So we have our list, and now for every row, we're creating a book object and appending it to the list. Okay. All right, and this is gonna be our ID, is gonna be row 0 item. And then we're gonna have our volume ID, which is gonna be the second one. After volume ID, we have our title. There you go. And after title, we are gonna have our authors. So the order is the same order that you see over here, okay? So authors is gonna be the next one. After authors, we have our thumbnail, which is gonna be the one after. And then we're gonna have our state. And then we are gonna have our reading. Did we miss one? Yeah, that's all we need. So let's see, we have 1, 2, so we have 6, so that means we have 7. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we have 7 columns. So yeah, that should be it. And then we're just gonna do some cleanup, which is closing our cursor and then closing our connection. And then finally, we're gonna return our formatted books, okay? All right, so now let's give this a go. Let's restart and then go over here. So now you see we have our other endpoint called get books. Let's see what documentation you get from here. So it doesn't take in any parameter because we are not passing any parameter to this one. And you can see that it gives you an example response, which is a list of, I'll just zoom in. So you can see we have a list of this model. If you go to schema over here, you can see it's the book model and it's literally the model that you defined. So it's super cool. FastAPI, you get all these by default. You can customize these to give it a description and an example value, but for now we're gonna go with the bare bones. All right, so now let's go ahead and hit try it out and then execute. You see we get a 200 and then we get a list of all these books. Okay, so for every book, you see we're starting the IDs descending. So we get 19, 18, 17. So bigger to smaller. And for each of them, we're getting the ID, volume ID, title, authors, and everything. These are coming exactly from the database over here. Okay. All right, so we have our basic get books endpoint working. Now let's go ahead and build the next endpoint, which is gonna be to actually create a new book. Okay, so that's gonna be app, if I can type, that's gonna be a post endpoint because this is gonna be a new book that's being created. The status code is gonna be HTTP 201 created. Okay, and then we're gonna call it new book, and now this the post request will need to accept a request body, which is gonna be of book type. So we're gonna give it a book type. You're gonna see the cool thing this lets us do. So I'm gonna just return hello world for now. And I'm gonna show you what defining this does for you. All right, so now you have the new request post books, and now you see we have a request body and it's telling you what's the type of the request body. So it's the book schema, the exact schema that you defined here. And all you had to do was just define the request body over here. So super cool and really, really nice when the users of your API needs to figure out how they can actually use the API. Okay. All right, so once again, we're gonna connect to the database and get a cursor. So I'm gonna just do it the same way over here. So very similar, we're connecting and then we instantiate a cursor. And now we are gonna execute our query. So you're gonna do an execute and then we're gonna give it an F string, insert into book, insert into book, and then we're gonna give it a volume ID, title, authors, thumbnail, and state. Okay, and then you're gonna give it the values, which is gonna be the volume ID. This is gonna be a string, so we are putting the quotation there. Okay, that's the volume ID, and then we're gonna give it a title. There you go. Let me see. So yeah, we're gonna give it the title, and then after title we are gonna give it the authors. Okay, after authors we're gonna give it the thumbnail, and finally we're gonna give it the state. So we're not giving a rating, because when you're initially adding a book, you're not rating it. We're gonna have a different endpoint to get the rating, to post the rating. What's that state? Okay, so that should do it, our execute statement, and then just some housekeeping, which is gonna be closing the cursor, committing the connection, committing the changes. So when you execute it, this is written to in memory, and then you have to commit it to make it actually go ahead and write it to disk. Otherwise, if you don't commit it and close the connection, you're going to lose the rate. All right, and then we're just going to return, because we're not returning the data back, so we're just going to return an empty response. All right, so let's try it out and see what happens. Okay. All right, so these are books, so we're going to try it out. And now you see the request body, it's already formatted for you. We're not going to pass it an ID because we want this to be automatically generated. We're going to give it a volume ID. Let's say YouTube demo 123. The title is going to be, let's say, YouTube book test. Author is going to be, let's say, Rutiza. Thumbnail, we're going to give it some random picture.com, just like a random URL. State, let's give it 0, and we don't need a rating right now. Okay, right now let's go ahead and execute this. We got a 201 and the response body of null. That's because our backend is returning nothing, and our status code is set to 201. Now let's go ahead into our database and actually check if it's there. And there you go. We have our YouTube demo, which is a volume ID, the title, the author, the thumbnail, the state, and the rating. So yeah, new books are gonna be added very easily now, and this is gonna be, if you remember, every time we search for a book and then hit add, that is gonna go ahead and actually add it to the library. Okay. All right, so now we have our second endpoint done, which is gonna be adding a new book. So just to recall, we have a status endpoint just to make sure our API is working. Then we have a get books endpoint. This gives you all the books that are in the database. Then we have a post endpoint. This is gonna be when you're adding a new book to your library. And now we need two more very small endpoints. One is gonna be a put endpoint, and this is gonna be in the books resource, and then we're gonna call it update rating. Okay, and the status code is gonna be 200. Let's call it update rating. So initially, remember our update, initially when we're posting a new book, we're not giving it a rating, and by default the rating is being null. So this endpoint is going to be used when we actually post a rating in the app. Okay, let me show if I can show you. Can I show you? Might not be working correctly right now. So yeah, let's roll on with it. You're going to see how the two work together when we actually build the front end. So for update rating, this is going to take in request, of course, and let's go ahead and define that first. Okay, so we're gonna call it update rating request body. It's gonna inherit from base model again, and all it's gonna take in is a volume ID so that we know which one to actually update, and it takes in the new rating, which is gonna be an int. That's all we need. And we are gonna go ahead and give it our update rating body, which is gonna be an update rating request body. Okay. Same thing as before, we are gonna go ahead and connect to our database. And then we are gonna do our query, which is gonna be, once again, very straightforward. It's gonna be a f string, that's gonna be an update book set rating equals update rating body dot new rating. You're gonna put a where clause, where vol, because that's how we're identifying which row to update. Where volume ID equals, and then you give it the update rating body dot volume ID. Okay. And once that's done, you do your housekeeping, which I'm just gonna copy paste. So you're closing the cursor, committing the changes, closing the connection, and then returning. Okay. All right, now let's go and actually try this out. Is this even working? Oops, not that. Okay, this is working right now. You see our book over here called YouTube Book Test. Yeah. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and, so you see we have a put request called update rating. So let's go ahead and hit try it out. So over here you see the schema, which says update rating request body. Okay. We're gonna hit try it out, and then it sticks in a volume ID and a new rating. So I'm gonna go ahead and take the volume ID of our test data, which is right now rating is set to null. I'm gonna put it over here and then get rid of, what was it, 1, 2, 3? 1, 2, 3. Okay, and let's give it a rating of 4. So just to show you again, this is a rating of null right now. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and hit execute. We're getting a 200 back with no response body. Let's go ahead and refresh this. And you see, where's our data? So this is this row over here. So this has a rating of 4. Even in the front end, remember this was not rated before. And now this has 4 stars, that means its rating is 4. All right, so that works. And now we are gonna make our last endpoint, which is gonna be moving the book from section to section. So remember how if you hit the button, you can move the book. So we're gonna support that one. All right. So now, where is our, there you go. All right, last one, that's gonna be a put to, this is gonna be books, and then we're gonna call it update book state, and the status code of 200. Okay, we're gonna call it update state, and then we're gonna give it our update state request body. Now let's actually create a new type, which we're gonna call update state request body. It inherits from base model. And now what does this one have? Very similar to the previous one. This is gonna have a volume ID. That's how we identify a book. And then we are gonna have the new state. This is gonna be the new state that we wanna change to. Okay. And let's copy that. Okay. And now let's go ahead and actually create the logic. So the first thing is going to be, once again, just building up the connection and then getting a cursor, and then we want to execute our query. Okay, that's going to be an update book set status equals, it's going to be update state request body dot new state. And then we're gonna identify our row by the volume ID. The dot volume ID. Okay. All right, and then same thing. We're gonna close our cursor. We're gonna commit our changes and then close the connection. And then we're just gonna do an empty return. All right, so this should be working now. So let's go ahead and try it out. So Now you see a new endpoint here called update book state, and that takes in a volume ID and a new state. So let's look at the data. So we are gonna do it with our demo data here again. So let's see, right now the state is 0. So let's change that. So state can be completed is 0, unfinished is 1, and wishlist is 2. Okay. So we're gonna go ahead and try this out. We're gonna give it the volume ID and new state. Let's say right now it's in completed. We're gonna move it to wishlist, which is gonna be 2. Okay. Okay, so our new state is gonna be 2. Execute. We got a 200. Now let's go and check it here. This did not. Oh yeah, so this is 0 now. Was it 0? It was 0 before, right? Huh. Okay. Let's see. Did we get any error? Wait, it did not make the request. Oops. Let's see. Why didn't it make a request? What did we get? So response, did we not execute it? Let's try executing it. URL is not a valid or contains user credentials. What? That makes no sense. New state of 2. Execute. Okay, I'm gonna refresh this to see whatever is happening. Let's go ahead and see our endpoint. So we have a put endpoint called update book state that takes in a request body. Yeah, I mean, this should work. Let's try it out again. I'll just give it a random one, a new state of 2. Type error, URL is not valid or contains user credentials. I'm not sure what that means. Am I not getting it here? I'm not even getting the request here, which is very, very interesting. All right, time for us to debug to see what is happening. So what happens if we try to make the request from Insomnia? Let's actually test this out. So test request. So it's gonna be a put, and it's gonna be to localhost. Oh, wait a minute. Did I miss parentheses? Oh yeah, there you go. Okay, perfect. So this should work now. We're gonna try it out. Let's get our ID again. And once again, just to remind you, our state is 0. I'm gonna put it there, and the new state is gonna be 2. Execute. Did we get it again? Did I not? Did I not? I did not. Oh my god, this is a mess. All right, so now let's execute. Oh, I need to refresh. Okay. Give it the volume ID and give it the new state. Okay, at least we're getting a 500, which is good. Column status of relation book does not exactly, because it's not status, it's called state. All right, let's try it out again now. I'm gonna give it the volume ID and a state of 2. And finally, we get a 200. Let's say our state was 0 before. We're gonna refresh it. This is the row, set to 2. Before our book was completed, which is state of 0, it should go to wishlist, which is a state of 2. I'm gonna go ahead and refresh. And the new book is over here. If you wanna go ahead and move it to unfinished, which is gonna be 1, you can very easily do that by hitting it to 1 and then refreshing. And now your book is over here. And what essentially the front end is gonna do is use this endpoint to move the book. So let's bring it, let's give it back to a state of 2 so that I can show you how it works. Okay, so I'm gonna refresh. So see, the book is over here now. Now I'm gonna hit purchased book. It moves over here. If you see, we just called our put endpoint over here. Now if we hit completed book, it moves all the way up here. And you see, we made another put request to update book state. So that's how the endpoint is gonna work. All right, so that is all we need for the app to be working. You can already see that the app is working right now. Let's go ahead and delete our mock data, and I'm going to show you how the whole thing is working. Okay, we don't need you anymore. Perfect. All right, so first thing we did is let's go check this out. So we created our status endpoint, which is just to make sure that the setup was correct. Then we created our books endpoint. This endpoint is being called every time we load the library. If you go to library, all the books are coming from that. The next one is our post books endpoint. This is when you're creating a new book. Let me see if this is working with the front end. So let's put like soccer maybe. And then search book. Let's get a good one. Let's go ahead and get soccer and philosophy. If you hit add book, book added, let's see if this works. Yep, so you see the book over here. So to do that, the front end is using this post endpoint over here. And now update rating. We're gonna come to that. Let's look at the other one, which is update book state. The front end is using that to move this book from wishlist to unfinished to completed. Okay, so if you hit purchased book, this moves it to unfinished, and we're calling that endpoint to make it happen. And now if you hit completed book, it moves all the way to the top, and this is being done through this endpoint too. And the last endpoint we have is the update rating endpoint. By default, once you move a book to the completed section, the rating is set to null. Now if we can give it like a 3-star, 4-star, let's give it a 3-star. And we just use this endpoint to post the new rating to the backend. And if I refresh, the data should be retained, 3-star. And soccer and philosophy, let's look at the database. Over here, you can see it has a state of 0, rating of 3. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete it now. Refresh, and the book is gone from here. All right, so that is how the backend is gonna work. We are gonna come back and see how it works when we're building the front end, because we need to connect the two together. So that's gonna be in part 2. And in part 3, we're gonna take a zoomed out look at how the whole thing is working, and maybe like talk about the design, the API, the database, and all those things. So I really hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you learned how to build the backend of this app. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. With that being said, hopefully you have a good rest of the day, and I'm gonna catch you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.